tonight we have two very wonderful people here. We have Maggie Taft and Jonathan Mekinda, and they're doing a presentation called What Does Modern Mean in Chicago? So Maggie is going to talk about modern art, and Jonathan is going to talk about modern design. So help me welcome Maggie and Jonathan.
We do not have microphones, so if you need me to speak up, maybe just put up your hand and I'll try to project more loudly. So I am going to talk a little bit about what modern art meant in Chicago. And broadly speaking, modern art is said to have arrived in Chicago in 1913 when the International Exhibition of Modern Art was shown at the Art Institute. It had come from New York, it was headed to Boston when it left. And this exhibition was important because it was one of the first times that Americans really saw works by the behemoths of European modern art, people like Duchamp, Kandinsky, Matisse, Picasso. And when it came to Chicago, some people were really excited about it, and others a little bit less so. And perhaps the most spectacular rejection of this arrival of modern art in Chicago, students at SAIC staged a trial of Henry Hair Mattress, a kind of stand-in for Henri Matisse, outside of the Art Institute on the exhibition's closing day. And after they found Henry Hair Mattress guilty for art crimes, they then burned a number of reproductions of Matisse works, including a reproduction of Blue Nude. You can see a thumbnail of it on the upper right-hand corner. One of the things that is really interesting about the Chicago iteration of this exhibition is, new as modern art was, it actually included a work by a Chicago artist, Manier Dawson. So this work, Dawson actually loaned to the exhibition with a lot of reservation. When he was invited to contribute something, he told the curators, I don't have anything that's appropriate. They basically strong-armed him by showing up at his studio and refusing to leave until he permitted them to walk away with this painting. And what I think is really interesting about this is it provides a little bit of a clue into what constituted modern art in Chicago. In a lot of ways, this looks like European modern art. It's abstract, it's got this expressive dimension. In fact, many people have called Manier Dawson a kind of American Kandinsky. But for Dawson, he did not believe that this work had a place in an exhibition of modern art. So what actually did modern art look like in Chicago if someone making work that looks like this, looks like things we think about as modern, didn't necessarily believe it to be so? One of the critics in Chicago in the early 20th century said that what modern art meant here, and we could probably extrapolate and say, well, maybe this applies in many cases, is it meant an artist who was engaged with individualist expression rather than regimented. So a painter, a sculptor who wasn't necessarily following the rules of a particular school, but rather pursuing individual ambitions, individual means of expression. That is absolutely one way to define it, one way to define what modern art was on the part of a critic active in Chicago in the 1930s. But I think with the vantage of our 21st century perspective, we can also identify a number of other attributes that thread together some of the really distinctive practice that was operating here. It is absolutely true that there were plenty of people operating individualistically. For example, Messina Barden, Gertrude Abercrombie, H.T. Westerman. In fact, this Messina Barden painting, the head on that platter is the head of that critic who described modern art as individualistic. These artists have actually, one could say, have operated so individualistically that it's been difficult to place them within the history of 20th century art more broadly. They just don't really seem to fit with the narratives we really have. But some of the other narratives that I do think thread together modern art in Chicago and are a way to think about what actually constituted modern here, I'm going to talk about via examples. So I'll give 5 different characterizations and just an example of a work for each to kind of make it vivid. So the first thing is an attention towards figuration. I'm showing you here a painting by Ivan Albright. There's an exhibition of some of his works at the Art Institute right now. Now, I think it's absolutely fair to say Figuration is modern. Figuration has been around in art forever. But one of the things that distinguishes work by Albright and other Chicago artists is an interest not so much in the idealized human figure, but instead in the kind of grotesque human figure. Perhaps you can see the kind of gray flesh tones here, the really exaggerated cellulite on this woman's legs, even her neck and arms. She's supposed to be about 19, 20 years old, the woman depicted here. And you can see Albright really interrogating the human body as just kind of a mass of flesh and muscle and bone. And this comes up again and again in the work of Chicago artists, interested in figuration, interested in the human body, but interested in pursuing that body as grotesque rather than as idealized. Another really crucial feature to modern practices in Chicago is an attention to socially engaged art. Here I'm showing you not a work, but rather the facade of the Southside Community Art Center, which was funded by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was broadly conceived as an endeavor to employ artists during the Great Depression, and also to use the work that they produced to generate a robust American culture on par with that of Europe. Now, the Southside Community Art Center, I think, is really unique for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's the only one of these community art centers that has been consistently operating since its founding in 1940 is when it started really going. 1941 is when there was the formal opening, but the seeds for it were laid in the 1930s. And the Southside Community Art Center, located, as you see, at 38th and Michigan, is in the heart of Bronzeville, is in a neighborhood where people live, where people work, and it's designed to not only provide a space for artists to practice, so for instance, Gordon Parks, a very important photographer, has his first studio there, but also to invite people from the neighborhood who live and work in the neighborhood to come and practice at the same time that Gordon Parks is working in his studio. People from the newly constructed Ida B. Wells homes are coming to the Southside Community Art Center for courses on home decor. And these two practices are not seen as anathema, as serious art on the one hand and sort of casual arts and crafts creative thinking on the other, but part and parcel of a unified mission to serve the people in the neighborhood inclusively, the people including an art population, people who are professional artists, and then people who are casually interested, or maybe to generate that kind of casual interest among the people who live there. And I think we see this kind of socially engaged art really active today with the work of people like Dan Peterman, Theaster Gates. So in addition to an attention to figuration and a socially engaged practice, another really key feature of modern art in Chicago is an attention and a real consideration in investigating new materials and new technologies. I'm showing you this work by Moholy-Nagy, and it's probably the work that looks the most like what we think of when we think about modern art. There are a few reasons for this. There's some abstract representation going on, or I shouldn't say abstract representation, but some abstraction going on. There's this kind of interesting play between painting and sculpture. Painting because this work hangs on the wall, sculpture because it's three-dimensional. But the reason I'm showing you this is not because it looks like modern art as we think about modern art, but rather because Moholy-Nagy is really interrogating new materials here. This is a work in plexiglass. Plexiglass was really just then being developed via new polymers, and there were all sorts of new plexiglass products that were being refined and revised. And Moholy-Nagy is interested in them because he wants to explore the way that these new materials allow him to advance his pre-existing interests in the properties of light. So he's investigating new materials, not just for the sake of the new materials, but to see what can these new materials do for his practice. I think one of the reasons people like Moholy-Nagy, but also a number of other artists, are interrogating these new materials, new technologies, is because Chicago is such a center for industrial production. There's a lot of people making stuff out of new materials right here. I'm sure Jonathan will talk a little bit about that production. The next key feature or through line that characterizes some of what constitutes the modern in Chicago is cross-cultural exchange. And as an example of that, I'm showing you a print by Elizabeth Catlett. The print was made in 1952, published some years later, but it's a lino cut, which is a form of printmaking that uses a linoleum block. And it's a convenient form of printmaking because linoleum's really easy to work with. It's also cheap, so you can make you can do large editions and distribute them cheaply. You don't need a lot of money to make large editions in this medium. And where Elizabeth Catlett learned and started making lino cuts was in Mexico. She went down to Mexico and worked with a printmaking collective, the TGP, and she was one of many Chicago artists who worked with this printmaking collective. She eventually moved permanently to Mexico, became a permanent member of this collective rather than a kind of honorary member, as a number of other Chicago artists were. And one of the things I think is really interesting about this example and why it so nicely illustrates this cross-cultural exchange is even though she's using a technique that she learned with this Mexican collective, she's deploying it to represent a distinctively American subject matter, an African-American sharecropper. This is one example among many, not only of these Chicago artists learning from this Mexican print collective, but also going elsewhere to the American Southwest, picking up techniques, tools, subjects, and bringing them back to Chicago. But you also have in Chicago itself a lot of cross-cultural exchange happening, in part because it is such a center for migration and immigration. So many different ethnic groups living in the city and intermingling and exchanging tools and techniques. The last thing, in addition to figuration, socially engaged art, experiments with new materials, and this cross-cultural exchange, is a really vehemently political art, and a political art that is not only a kind of critique or protest, but a political art that's dedicated to putting forward positive images. So what I'm showing you here, and that term positive images, I'm actually borrowing from some members of the Black arts movement who used it to describe their project. What I'm showing you here is a mural, short-lived mural that was on 43rd and Langley from 1967 to 1971. And it was the result of a collaboration between the muralist William Walker and Obasi. And they, on this wall, on the side of a building that housed a convenience store, painted all of these pictures of real lions of African-American political, cultural, religious leadership. One of the things that's interesting about the work that they're doing is that this mural is a kind of living artwork insofar as they paint it, then they go back and they change it in response to some of the feedback they're getting from the people who live and work in this neighborhood. The reason why they're doing this is because what they're trying to do is produce, like I said, positive images of African-American leaders for an African-American public. And I think we see some of this kind of practice today, an investment in political image making that's not only critical, but also invested in positive representation in film, in television, in art making, in design. So I guess the thing I want to close with is that though the mandate for this conversation was how is modern in Chicago so different from what we think of as contemporary, I actually want to propose that a lot of the things that actually do characterize modern art in Chicago are very vivid in contemporary art today and continue to animate contemporary art. And I think it makes this broader art design Chicago effort to reconsider the history of art in Chicago and design too so important and so relevant today, because not so much this sort of sets the stage for everything that is happening in a global art world today, but it does offer a little bit of a prehistory. We can see how some of the things, investigations, for instance, into the internet. There's a show at the MCA right now about how contemporary young artists are playing with the internet. These kinds of attentions to new technologies, new materials, Chicago artists are thinking about that. Attention to social practice that drives so much innovative work today, Chicago artists are thinking about it throughout the period that we think of as modern. I'll turn it over to Jonathan now.
Thank you. Okay. So Yes, thank you for that reminder. So I wanted to begin with a work like a number of those that Maggie has shown that I think, or that I hope will sort of challenge your conceptions of what modern design is. This, of course, is a cover and an inside page from they're actually from two different catalogs of 1918 of Sears, Roebuck and Company. And I think this is a fruitful starting point because I think these works are emblematic of the kinds of conditions that would come to be central to modern design as we sort of visualize it in the middle decades of the 20th century. And particularly what I think we can see here very clearly is the ways in which ideas of the modern rested on, in Chicago, I think especially, rested on notions of material abundance. And particularly a material abundance made possible through scientific discovery and technological innovation, sort of brought to the people or consumers, if you are of a more cynical bent, right, through business. Right? And I think, Sears Roebuck, in terms of what it offered, was clear evidence of this. If you've ever looked at a Sears Roebuck catalog from this period, they are absolutely enormous by virtue of the sheer number of goods that the company sold. And I included the page just to give you a visual sense of that abundance, of what was available. One of the other key points, of course, that would come to sort of define this sense of material abundance based on technological progress as the modern was the sense that this material abundance was the sort of evidence for advanced civilization. Right? And I think it's clear that sort of over the course of the 20th century, and particularly in the middle decades, notions of the modern, right, were not just tied to sort of technological progress, but were tied to civilizational progress, and that those two forces were really seen as deeply integrated. And in fact, hopefully one of the things I'll touch on, if I remember, is that integration of civilization and technology is one of the defining factors of modern design as a category. The last point to sort of make about this as a kind of introduction is that, of course, there doesn't seem to be anything modern looking about it, right? It has an image of the sort of vast Sears complex here in Chicago. The arrangement on the cover is very traditional, very conventional, sort of according or adhering to basic principles of the classical tradition with a centrally placed image. You have these sort of sculptural elements surrounding it. The text is aligned to the center as well. And so what also defines then the sort of emergence of an idea of modern design is, over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, the development of a formal vocabulary that was seen to embody these new conditions of material abundance and advanced civilization, right, that this didn't do. And I think we want to say it didn't do it because that simply wasn't on the table at the time, not because the people who put this together weren't aware of that. And it's really only in the 1920s there that we start to see the emergence in Chicago of the idea that this new civilization demanded and was capable of providing a new visual order. Right, which we might think of as a style as well. And this, of course, is a shop window display at Marshall Field and Company, a high-end department store here in Chicago. And I think there are sort of a couple issues that are important to sort of note about this. I think this is obviously sort of recognizably modern in the sense in which it is the sort of the underlying structure is quite formally simplified, right? As a kind of key condition of it. I think one of the other things that's important about the emergence of these early explorations of a kind of modern visual vocabulary is the sense in which they are tied to the sort of of prosperity of the 1920s that emerges in the US in the wake of the First World War. And I think we're also familiar with the notion of the Roaring Twenties, right, which really encompasses that sort of period of growth up until the Great Depression of the 1920s. And I think, one of the ways that's manifested in the world of design is that this sort of awareness of and interest in a new, distinctively modern formal vocabulary is that it is also really sort of concentrated in the realms, especially of luxury and leisure. Right, so if you think of the sort of great icons of Art Deco architecture as just one example, the sort of public examples of that would be, movie palaces, for example, or a number of wonderful commercial high-rises here in Chicago that exemplify this style as well, and certainly among the wealthy. By the second half of the 1920s, this was the sort of the most up-to-date style that wealthy patrons were asking their architects and fashion designers to deploy. Right? One other point that I would make about this that I think is clear here is that this, even as there is this interest in the modern as a visual language, designers and artists and architects are drawing very interestingly on ideas of the primitive and the exotic, right? And I think we can sort of recognize that those interests in the primitive and the exotic from contemporary viewpoints are really sort of problematic in the way in which they essentialized places outside of the US and Europe as effectively unmodern, right, by virtue of their lack of technological progress and the absence of the material abundance that was associated with modernity, particularly here in the U.S. And finally, I just want to touch on this term, Art Deco, because I think this is probably a term that we can associate very easily with this. And I think it's a useful term in the sense in which it describes how these initial sort of pushes towards a modern formal language in the popular realm were really sort of rooted in an ambition on the part of architects and designers to find a way to modernize the classical tradition, right? Which is to think about how modernity, right, could be expressed through a new formal language that still adhered to classical ideas of beauty, right? And I think it's fair to say that this, of course, is a far cry from European avant-garde, which was fundamentally based on the idea that the conditions of modernity embodied a fundamental break with at least the recent sort of past, and that the introduction of the machine represented something so fundamentally new that an entirely new formal language needed to be developed. In Chicago, and I think across the U.S. and really much of Europe, much more popular was what we see here, was an effort to be simultaneously modern and to connect to this classical that classical tradition. It's in the 1930s, as I think we can see here in this sort of iconic domestic appliance, the Mixmaster, that there starts to become within popular discourse, as opposed to sort of architectural and artistic discourse, an interest in the machine as a model both for a new formal language and also increasing embrace of the idea that the machine was the fundamental fact of modernity, right? And it's really in the 1930s that we have a solidification of the idea of the machine age. And all that entails in terms of describing an age in which the machine was no longer relegated or isolated to the factory or the industrial workplace, but that the machine was increasingly brought into the home, Right? And domestic appliances were one of the main areas where this occurred. Probably the first first machine to be domesticated in this way was the automobile, beginning in the really in the 19-teens with the advances in mass production made by Ford, which dramatically drove down the cost of automobiles and made them quite remarkably affordable. Already by the early 1920s, in fact, the automobile market in the US was close to saturation. So the automobile was sort of the leading edge of making machines part of everyday life, and showcasing how the presence of machines in everyday life would dramatically transform how people lived. Right? What was possible, and really materialize the ideas of technological progress. Right? Through scientific discoveries, through industrialization. I think in a shift from the Marshall Fields window, what we also start to see here is the development of a formal language that would generally be described as streamlining. And I think this point, the popularity of that term in the 1930s points to the ways in which even as artists and architects and designers and the public at large embrace the reality of the machine age, right, the promise of modern design at that moment was to find a way to make the machine fit into the home, to make the machine approachable and relatable to individuals. Right? Streamlining, of course, is a kind of visual effect derived from natural bodies, right? But that over the course of the 1930s was first applied to airplanes, locomotives, automobiles, and then increasingly applied to all sorts of domestic objects, as well as objects in the office that had nothing to do with movement or motion or speed. And I think it's that connection to nature, however sort of abstracted it is in the language of streamlining, right, that made it such a popular visual language in the 1930s for these new kinds of objects, that made them visually approachable, right, by virtue of the way in which they concealed, enclosed the sort of machines that were necessary for the operation of these domestic appliances within smooth surfaces that you didn't have to worry about sort of catching your clothing on, cutting yourself on, that were visually and practically appropriate as well. Now, Maggie sort of touched on the importance of thinking about Chicago as a site of cross-cultural exchange, especially by virtue of the way in which it was such an important center for immigration, both from abroad and from within the US. And in this sort of conventional histories of modern design in Chicago, great attention has been put on the arrival in the second half of the 1930s of a number of important European avant-garde architects and designers. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy would be one of the best known. He came to Chicago to direct a new school of design, first called the New Bauhaus, then called the School of Design, then finally established as the Institute of Design, which still exists as part of IIT. The other sort of great icon of this is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who came to direct the School of Architecture. So in conventional histories of modern design, the arrival of these leading figures of the European avant-garde marks the sort of birth of modern design proper in Chicago. One of the things that I think, a point that both Maggie and I, would stress is that, of course, modern design was alive and well before any of these people came from Europe to Chicago. And that this was a kind of central preoccupation for almost every practicing architect and designer, how to deal with the fact that the modern world was so fundamentally different from previous epochs, and how to sort of reconcile or how to deal with those differences, whether through re-articulating and reorienting established approaches, or whether through deriving new approaches altogether. This poster is by a French designer Jean Carlu. Interestingly enough, not a particularly sort of well-known figure of European avant-garde, but I think is useful here for the way in which he is emblematic of the efforts of a particularly important Chicago institution, the Container Corporation of America, which of course is relevant to this exhibition here. It was CCA that sponsored the Great Ideas of Western Man project, I think beginning in the early 50s, and the sort of origins of that project lay with CCA's beginning interest in hiring designers starting in the mid-1930s. And CCA really became one of the sort of leading companies to think about how a distinctive approach to modern design could be used to define the company, not only in terms of its commercial activities, but actually also, in fact, in terms of its sort of place in society, culture, civilization at large. Right? So again, the conventional story would sort of see CCA as yet another channel through which modern design was introduced properly to Chicago. I would argue instead that we want to recognize that it was already this sort of activity of discussion around modern design in Chicago that even led somebody like Walter Pepke, the head of CCA, to think about establishing such a program. And in fact, the person he hired to direct it, Egbert Jacobson, came to Chicago from New York, and Egbert Jacobson was somebody who had spent a career up until then working in advertising agencies. So the project and that sort of appeal of a Chicago business to somebody with that kind of established pedigree in advertising, right? I think that really sort of reveals how modern design was understood in Chicago as fundamentally connected to commerce and industry, right? In the sense in which commerce and industry were understood as the vehicles through which actually the progress of technology would be translated into material abundance. And certainly that was a kind of view at odds with the sort of radical avant-garde ideas of so many of the Europeans who came to Chicago and to the US. And a view here of the first Chicago area industrial design exhibit in 1954, I think a wonderful image by virtue of the way in which it shows how by the early 1950s, design was everywhere. I know it's hard to make out here, but you can see vacuum cleaners, coffee pots. I think this is a lathe or a drill press. So everything from sort of industrial equipment to ordinary domestic objects, all by the 1950s were seen as the sort of the responsibility of the designer. And certainly we want to think about the rise of a popular understanding of design as being intimately tied to ideas of the modern, right? In the sense that these kinds of objects needed to be designed, right? That somebody should have the job of thinking about how these machines could be better shaped in order to support the people who would use them, right? And I think the sort of diversity and range of objects that we get in this one image also points to how Chicago was central to the emergence of and the dissemination of this kind of ubiquitous design, and that again, that sort of spread really had very little to do with many of the ideas of or the sort of social and political ambitions of the avant-garde, even as increasingly over the course of the 1950s and 1960s, the sort of formal ideas of the avant-garde, particularly the drive towards abstraction and simplification, would become increasingly sort of accepted and part of sort of the everyday language of designers. And a very important project from the mid-1960s, I think, which sort of carries that point even further in terms of the sense of the ubiquity of design by the mid-1960s, and also the ways in which ideas of this sort of task of modern design being to address function, right, being to sort of improve the quality of everyday life, very much embodied here. There's a wonderful story behind the design of this trash cans. This was the first plastic trash can ever mass produced. It was incredibly successful. And the designer, Charles Harrison, tells a simple story of his inspiration, which is that he grew fed up with the enormous din that went with weekly trash collection in Chicago. Because everyone would put out their metal trash cans, and so trash collection would begin early in the morning, and everybody would be woken to the sounds of the trash collectors, throwing these big metal bins around, and the din that created. So it's a wonderful story in its sort of in how it shows a very typical idea of modern design is this very simple, pragmatic sort of origin, right? An adoption of a kind of new material put to this very ordinary use, and yet it has a profound effect in terms of transforming that experience and making it much less harsh and sort of aggressive. Right? It should also be noted, of course, that Charles Harrison is remarkable in his own right as one of the sort of first really successful African-American designers in Chicago. And certainly one of the other sort of distinguishing features of modern design in Chicago was the way in which it provided an avenue for African-Americans to define a kind of new set of career possibilities within the emerging design professions. Harrison studied at the School of the Art Institute. Graduated in the mid-1950s, I believe, early 1950s. Actually couldn't find a job after graduation because he was African American. He ended up being hired by one of his teachers at the School of the Art Institute, Henry Glass, who was a European emigre, a survivor of the Holocaust, who sort of recognized in Harrison someone undergoing a kind of similar experience of discrimination. Through his first job, first works with Glass, Harrison then began to establish professional networks in the city. He eventually got a job at a number of consulting firms that were doing work for Sears. He did a lot of work for Sears, the best known of which is actually the ViewMaster, a wonderful little red plastic device you might know for looking at stereoptic images. Only in the early 1960s did Sears change its policy such that it could actually hire Harrison. And he ended up spending, I think, almost 30 years at the company, rising to a very high level. So his story is also sort of emblematic of the ways in which modern design was so significant in Chicago, not just because of how it looked, right, but actually because of how it operated. And as a kind of final image, I wanted to show this one, which I think is challenging in all sorts of ways and also sort of productive in terms of bringing us up to the present. Vince Color's advertising agency, really sort of following in the footsteps, or let's say a fellow traveler to Harrison, one of the first, if not the first, independent advertisement agency set up by African Americans, very successful. There's actually a documentary in the process of being produced on Vince Colors and some of his partners. And I think a wonderful example in which it shows how by the late 1960s, this sort of a particular kind of idea of modern design had become established, what we probably think of as, or what I would describe anyways, as kind of modernism, in terms of its very severe sort of simplification, a kind of removal of any elements, the treatment of the two-dimensional surface as a kind of abstract plane within which the sort of arrangement of type works both as text and as a kind of formal element in its own right. But of course here the content is tremendously powerful, and I think points very, I think we can sort of read it as an example of how by the late 1960s, the sort of ideas of modern design that had been so powerful and so successfully articulated in Chicago through the middle decades of the 20th century were sort of being taken apart from within, right? At least in one sense, those ideas that I talked about at the beginning of a kind of material abundance based on technological progress, right, translated through industry, really rested on an idea of modernity itself as a kind of uniform, homogeneous condition, right? That was tied to advances of industrial capitalism and the sort of the advances of liberal democracy, right? And what we see here very powerfully, I think, is using the kind of most advanced visual language that had been developed through the 30s and 40s as the embodiment of those ideas, used here being to show how those ideas of kind of uniformity, of connectedness, of sameness, right, were actually in many ways working to efface the sort of extreme variations and differences actually latent within that society, right? In some ways we can say very clearly that sort of notions of material abundance were not nearly so widespread as they had been imagined to be in the 1920s and 1930s, and certainly no longer even seem so within the realm of the possible, right, as they did during the 1930s and the 1940s. Right? So in sort of, as a kind of, a kind of concluding point to the future, I think we can think of this as really in some ways sort of embodying the downfall of the modern, in the sense in which the modern encapsulated a kind of coherent, internally consistent, unified project, not only of design, but of civilization. Right? And that we see that idea of civilization here being taken apart. And it's that sort of state of kind of, we might say sort of fragmentation. We might also describe it as a state of sort of, diversity, right? Of extreme variation that we are still sort of grappling with today. Okay, I will stop there. I've probably gone on much too long.
We should open it up for a conversation, I think.
Yes, we should.
I guess if there are questions or comments about general points or even specific design objects or works of art, this would be a great opportunity for us not to talk at you anymore, but to talk to each other.
Wall of Respect. Have you seen the, I forget if it's just the revisiting the Wall of Respect or the modern or the new Wall of Respect? Have you seen any information about that project that is like apparently an ongoing thing?
I don't know. I don't know about this new Wall of Respect.
Yeah, it's not in the same place.
Yeah.
I only remember like tangentially like, oh, I'd seen it. I'm like, hey, that's a thing that I know about. And it was connected, and I can't remember the details, but it's a thing that exists. And
Thanks for drawing my attention to it. I'm sorry that I can't offer anything about it. Please.
Where would something like this appear? It's kind of interesting that it's advertised in foreign advertising agency, so it's fairly popular seeming to.
That is a great question. From what I know, this would have been placed primarily in trade publications with the idea that they were making a pitch to businesses to be able to reach an audience that had hitherto been ignored. Right? And that they were doing that, I think, really in a sort of a way that, to contemporary taste, I think feels very sort of contradictory, right? In the sense that an advertising agency would become, or would sort of conceive itself as a vehicle of empowerment, and that empowerment would happen through the world of commerce and business. But that was certainly the project. Right, and I think there are sort of a range of initiatives developed beginning in, already in the late 19 teens, but really flourishing in Chicago and other cities as part of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the sort of North, that involve sort of projects of empowerment through commerce, through business. And this is really a kind of sort of, as a historian, I'm inclined to see it as a culmination of those efforts, although of course it was also very much a beginning. And when you talk to African American designers who were working during that period and in the 70s and 80s, and even up to the present, that sense in which this was a way to, that this engagement with business was a way to open up opportunities is really profound, right? And again, I think sort of challenging to our ideas, because we tend to sort of think about, the sort of corporate world as a world that is about, about sort of simplifying us to consumers, right? But here there's an argument for the recognition of an individual as a consumer as a kind of act of empowerment. The other point I would sort of add to that is that I think, that's is also very much a part of the story of modern design in Chicago, in the way in which it sort of, engages commerce, in that kind of, open, positive, some would say sort of uncritical ways. So again, this was very much part of the advertising agency marketing itself to clients. Yeah.
That might have been the intent. However, back in the 60s, I recall seeing a poster. 60s had posters all over the place. And that may have appeared in commercial publications, but I think it may have been stolen by poster makers.
Ah.
And it was hung in different places. They might not have used the exact same words, but the idea certainly was there.
Yeah.
And this is the late 60s when there was so much activism in the world of civil rights that this was a perfect venue for them to use to spread that social activist thing. So actually, this design may have served a dual purpose.
Of course, yeah.
Which it wasn't intended to serve, but it certainly got the message across.
Yes.
And it contributed to spreading the word on civil rights in a bigger way than just interacting with people. I mean, it could be hung up and people could see it, and it could lead one to think in a broader sense. So that's just my comment.
Yeah.
Encountered this before.
Yeah.
So that I think also speaks to a certain mobility of images, which we see again and again, including, there's one really interesting example that relates to Container Corporation of an image that's used in an advertisement that is something like a domestic interior with a fruit bowl and some other household objects. There's also, in the collection of the Southside Community Art Center, which I mentioned earlier, a painting of the same composition. Now, I'm not sure that anybody really knows whether the painting was made first and that image was appropriated by Container, or if an artist or a member of a class at the Southside Community Art Center saw the poster and then painted the image. But I think it's another example of this way in which, authorized or not, you have images circulating across all sorts of media and jumping from one format, be it an advertisement in a commercial publication, to a poster, from a painting to a company advertisement, or vice versa. Not sure what the situation is there.
And the Southside Community Art Center was open to a lot of people to come in and do their activities, and many of them are unrecognized.
Yeah.
And we have evolved to the point where we're starting to recognize some of them. And Vince Colors, as much as I know about Chicago history and African American history, I've never seen his name before. So he not only was this designer, but he had an agency, and I may have seen this, no idea.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I would say, just because to follow up on the sort of fact of its newness, there will be an exhibition on African American design in Chicago, opening at the Chicago Cultural Center in October, late October, that I would encourage you all to check out. And I know on November 2nd and 3rd, there'll also be a day-and-a-half-long symposium on the subject.
Yeah.
So this reminds me of some of Volkswagen's advertisements, which brings me to a question like, at what point do you think that social activism, when it's tied to consumerism and marketing, do you reach a point where it crosses a line into manipulating or exploiting the groups that they're so-called, being activists towards? Not to say this particular.
Yeah.
But like with Volkswagen, they were providing a product for the trying to lead consumerism. So it's like, at what point do you cross a line and start taking advantage of the market, supposedly being an activist? Or I think it's a kind of an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm happy to go, but.
I guess I would say, I mean, I don't know that Container Corporation is the kind of organization that we would tend to think of as having an activist bent, but there is absolutely a mission involved in the original advertisements that they were commissioning also. There was this larger project of producing America as an icon of cultural leadership, of having America lead the kind of rebuilding of the United States after World War II. So I think what you're describing is absolutely apt, not only in cases of companies selling stuff to people who are, for all intents and purposes, claiming themselves as anti-consumerist, but we can also see, maybe it's too far to go to call it insidious, but a kind of rough edge on so much of the advertising that promises a better world, not only because you're drinking Coke and you're so happy, but also because you're buying into all sorts of value systems that may or may not have these kind of dark underbellies or just unrecognized edges to them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say for me, I don't think there is a line to be drawn when it comes to design. I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes design very interesting as a subject of historical study, right? I mean, certainly that proposition is, my view is subject to critique for sure. But I just, I think, I mean, I think you can't, how you would draw the line between the sort of what the opportunity, for work might have meant for somebody like Vince Cullors or Charles Harrison, Leroy Winbush, Emmett McBain. I mean, there's a whole host of designers even before that, Charles Dawson, et cetera, et cetera. And, the fact that material improvement, right, came at the cost of entering into a kind of world of consumption, I think is something, if it's possible to draw such a line, the line has to be drawn case by case. And my guess is that, there's always going to be good and bad. Not that one shouldn't go looking for those lines by any means, but that is the constant, for me, is the constant question.
Can I say one more, or did you have a response?
Yeah, I totally support activism through, with marketing and design. Like recently, Adidas, I think it was Adidas, just did this project where for every mile you ran, they would donate $1 to help clean the ocean. So I think activism through design and marketing has amazing potential, but I always wonder, like, at what point, I guess what you said, a case-by-case basis, like wondering at what point could something like that lead to exploitation?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my worst moments, I think those kinds of things are a joke, in the sense in which they point to the present impossibility to think of any alternatives to the world that we live in. And one of the things that is, inspiring as a historian about, in terms of thinking about modern design, or, sort of approaching modern design as, what modern design was, is precisely the sense in which there seemed to be the capacity to imagine alternatives. But that's my sort of worst moments. There's no doubt that is a kind of meaningful improvement, right? Better to have Adidas giving $1 than not giving $1.
I recently came across something talking about the relevance of Jane Austen today. Why read Jane Austen today? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons. One of them is because she lays out a model for how to participate in the system while still making your own space in it, or carving out a new space in the system. And I think this is actually a really important element to a lot of the development of African-American businesses in Chicago in the mid-20th century. So Adam Green, a historian at the University of Chicago, has written a really wonderful book about this called Selling the Race. And it's about a few different institutions, among them the Chicago Defender, a national African-American newspaper, Ebony and Jet, the magazines, and a few other organizations. I think one is a bank, and I can't remember what the other is, but that were so crucial because absolutely they are buying into a kind of capitalist system. But what they are doing is carving out a space for African-American citizens of Chicago and also nationally, the Defender, Ebony and Jet, those are national publications, to more actively participate in a system from which they had been excluded. That I don't think is a way of saying this is how it should work or this is how it always works, but it's one way of conceptualizing how it can work. A way of participating in the system but carving out a new area within it. Any other questions, or are we maybe out of time?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Thanks so much. I appreciate you guys being here, and thanks for coming today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.